just as fear has turned against Johnny Cortez, terrorizing him with its unrelenting persistence. Other emotions, too, can go awry. Anger, desire, sadness are just as tangible as fear, and any one of them can spin out of control with devastating consequences.
Emotion tells us what's good about our world, what's bad about our world. Emotion forms self-concept, but our whole self-concept can get away from us. We can feel hopeless and worthless. We can feel that there's no future for us.
Lauren Slater first checked into a psychiatric hospital at the age of 14, suffering from severe depression. 10 years later, after having been in and out of the same hospital, she was still suffering.
When I was 24, 25 years old, my 5th hospitalization was fairly brief. They were at the end of the line with me. What could they do for this girl, now become young woman who they'd seen year after year? And I was discharged from the hospital and I didn't have a place to go. So I went to this motel and I fell asleep. And I was in this half state between sleep and wake, and I could see very, very clearly where my life was going. I knew that I did not want to live the way I had been living. I saw myself clearly. I saw who I was and what I was and what I had become. And I knew I wanted out. And out meant 2 things, one of 2 things. It meant somehow either getting better, changing, or it meant leaving. And those were both options for me. It was at that moment in the hotel room that I made a choice. I wanted to try getting up. That's what I wanted to try first.
Lauren went on living, with depression grooved in her brain. Not the passing blues we all can feel, but a chronic and confounding disease.
We are still struggling to understand what goes wrong in the brain to cause depression. Because depression can have profound symptoms. It can change lives. It can lead people to end their lives. And yet, when we look at the brain of a depressed person, we don't see any holes in it, any obvious lesions. I mean, it's far different from many other disorders.
We don't know what causes it. We don't have a pathology of it like we do for Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. So all we have at the present time is we have a collection of clinical signs and symptoms.
To feel depressed, to me, is to feel dead. It's to feel that all of the things in your life that gave you comfort and meaning, they're no longer even familiar. Deadness, terror, horror, distorted time. It's the ultimate isolation. It's the ultimate wordlessness, which is why it's so hard to talk about it.
An image captures what words cannot. The depressed brain. No physical damage is apparent, but to scientists, its signature is clearly visible in patterns of brain activity. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain with which we understand and engage with our world, has grown dull and silent. The emotional core of the brain is sending the prefrontal cortex signals, flooding it with chemicals carrying emotional messages. But the prefrontal cortex can only make tentative attempts to respond.
There should be a constant interplay between what we feel and what we think. But in the state of intense depression, the balance between emotion and feelings and thinking and reasoning becomes out of whack.
Anyone can become depressed, but chronic, unrelenting depression seems to run in families, pass through the genes generation to generation, a vulnerability that can be heightened by traumatic experiences early in life.
Looking at my family history, you can see that depression runs through the family tree. My father has definitely struggled with depression, and his mother and his father suffered as well. So I know that it's there and it goes back. I also think, though, that the environment had a really significant role in how those genetic tendencies or inevitabilities were played out. There were episodes of violence, of pretty serious violence, where there would be punching, hitting, pulling by the hair, a lot of cruelty, a lot of humiliation, and it was like that day after day after day.
We know that there are critical periods in childhood when the brain is remarkably plastic. And one of the consequences of early trauma, it's very likely that the brain does not form the normal connections that it normally would, and it's going to have consequences in adulthood.
Most people who experience depression did not experience childhood abuse. But Charles Nemiroff believes that physical, sexual, even emotional abuse can make the brain abnormally sensitive to stress, and later in life, make some people more vulnerable to depression. Scientists have found that people with depression often produce too much of the stress hormone, cortisol.
Many conceptualize depression as the stress response gone awry. Stress is really an event that should be very time limited. You're exposed to a stressor, your stress hormone should be released and they should turn off very quickly.
But in the brain of a depressed person, stress triggers too much cortisol for too long. Chronic exposure to this normal stress hormone can be toxic to the brain.
You can think of it almost as leaving a scar, as changing the brain, as making the brain more vulnerable to subsequent depressions.
After my experience in that motel room, I really worked hard to pull it together. I tried to live without symptoms. I tried to live without collapsing. It was boot camp for a year. Absolute boot camp. I had charts, lists, this and that, anything to just get myself on the right road. Huge amount of sweat equity went into that effort, and it didn't work. And when it didn't work, I was ready, really ready to throw in the towel. And I wasn't just a year, it was those 10 years preceding it. I was exhausted. So suicide was a welcoming thought to me. People kill themselves when they are depressed as a way of trying to spare themselves from unremitting and unrelenting pain. Suicide is one viable cure for depression. That's how the depressed person sees it. But there's this tenacious part of not only me, but all of us. We want to live. So I called the psychiatrist that I had been seeing, and she said to me, there's this new drug on the market and I think we should try it. It's called Prozac. And my response to that was, I don't want another drug. And yet when the psychiatrist offered me a possible way out, I immediately jumped for it. And so I tried it. You know, swallow a little biochemical missile and boom, kaboom, you're changed.
The brain contains 100 billion cells, neurons, and they make 100 trillion connections or synapses. And each of the neurons release chemical substances called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are the legal tender of the brain. That's how these cells communicate with each other.
As the neurotransmitters flow through the brain like a river, sending a steady stream of information between the brain's emotional and thinking regions. Just a few milligrams of an antidepressant like Prozac, Zoloft, or Paxil can quickly and radically affect one of them, the mood-influencing chemical serotonin. In the synaptic gap between the neurons, where serotonin delivers messages from one cell to another, sit a series of molecules that work like locks on a canal, regulating the flow of serotonin, determining its rise and fall. In the depressed brain, serotonin is often at low ebb. An antidepressant can plug the entry to some of the molecular locks, forcing serotonin levels to rise in the open spaces between the cells, a change that occurs throughout the brain, but especially in the brain's prefrontal cortex.
And the fact that it occurs in the prefrontal cortex, I think, is very intriguing, since this is the very area that people would have guessed would be a critical area in being able to regulate your mood, for the brain to be able to get itself back on track.
Higher levels of serotonin stimulate a cascade of reactions that bring the brain back into balance. Within weeks, the symptoms of depression mysteriously lift.
What we really want to understand is that last step, that last bit, that change in the wiring, so that the I'm no good changes to maybe things are not so bad. And that is going to take an enormous amount of progress in neuroscience. But when we understand that, we're going to understand very, very important things about what it means to be human, how things go wrong, and how things can go right.
When I first went on Prozac for the first like 6 months, it were like probably the best 6 months of my life. Suddenly I could feel. I could feel pleasure, I could feel happiness, I could feel sadness. It was like this whole range of possibilities. I was walking around stunned. My senses were very different, colors were different, my taste buds were different, my tongue was different. This world was suddenly open to me that I had never really explored before. There are no words to convey how unbelievable that experience was. How much happiness I had.
It has been 12 years since Lauren first found relief from depression. Ever since, she has worked to rebuild her life. She received a doctorate in psychology, married, had a child.
In my more reductive moments, I tend to think, alter serotonin transmission, alter the person, beginning and end of story. But the story, of course, always gets more complicated.
You really are, one of the miracle stories here for this treatment.
I've been on this now for 12 years, and I always feel like, my big concern is that I'm on borrowed time with it. And I know
At this point, it's a borrowed decade.
A borrowed decade, more than a decade
right.
now, a borrowed decade plus 2 years, which is good, but I have to say, I don't know that I'm a Prozac wonder story. I mean, because,
Why?
well, because I started on 10 milligrams and am now, 8 times that, which is why I'm suspicious of the drug. I am very suspicious of the drug.
But Lauren, here's
Although I also, of course, am half in love with it, but I am suspicious of it.
the fact that you've been on the stuff. It's been your mainstay. You've been free of symptoms most of the time. We've been able to get you freer of symptoms when you've become symptomatic. Is both a nifty thing and one that's unfortunately a little rare in the treatment of chronic severe depression. One rarely sees a depression as severe as yours, which remits as fully as yours has.
I thought, now I have this drug and it's great. I thought I actually had it licked. But then It became a much more complicated relationship. It became I became an unreliable lover, one who had the capacity to save me and yet who could leave me at any moment utterly stranded.
Lauren is not cured of depression. Drugs only relieve the symptoms. And like an infection that resists an antibiotic, Lauren's brain periodically begins to resist the antidepressant. She relapses. Dosages must be increased. Different drugs must be found. Patients call it the Prozac poop out.
My biggest fear with Prozac poop out now is that now that I have a child, it's no longer just me. And I'm afraid that I will not be able to function as a parent. And that will obviously have repercussions for my daughter.
Lauren will always need medication to help her get on with her life, to simply go to work each day. But now she looks beyond her own suffering to helping others.
I think when I was young, I thought I was just lazy. And I think everyone else thought I was just lazy. But it's like when you're at the dentist office and you get like that lead cape put on you. When I'm depressed, I feel like I always have it on.
Now what you're telling me, okay, is that...
Drawing on her own experience with depression, Lauren has become a practicing psychologist, counseling patients at a community clinic in Boston. Like Lauren, many of them take drugs to relieve their depression.
You started off the therapy session saying that you have no resources outside of your doctors and your medication. You'd be a puddle of sugar should I and your psychopharmacologist and the pills themselves suddenly fly away. But when we look, I think that drug therapy probably gives a leg up, the ability to become symptom-free enough so that you can learn new ways of behaving. But I resist in myself and in other people being reduced simply to a series of biochemistry, or biochemical interactions. So in some ways I insist on there's got to be some kind of therapeutic process there that's not just talking about our synapses. You yourself told me that you've built a support network. You've come out of the closet with your depression, and that really helps. And these are all of the coping mechanisms that you have. The fact is that you have resources inside of you.
For many people, drugs alone are not enough to keep depression at bay. Research has demonstrated that the most effective way to treat depression is with a combination of drugs and talk therapy.
Talk therapy works because it works on the brain. Anytime we learn something new, anytime we change our mind about something, anytime we remember something, we can do that only by changing the physical structure of our brain, by changing, literally, synaptic connections so that we're processing information differently.
We can think of therapy as the brain learning a skill that's not unlike learning a complex motor skill, or, for example, becoming adept at a particular sport, or becoming adept at a musical instrument, where there's systematic practice, and that practice leads to a demonstrable change in behavior.
You know, the anxiety of getting depression is almost worse than the depression.
Yes. And the thing that you need to remember about that is that you have always gotten through it, maybe with cuts and scrapes and serious wounds, but you've always gotten through it. So... the curiosities and energies that had always been rightfully mine were finally taking their place. And yet for me it was not that simple. My personality, yes, had always consisted of suppressed energies and curiosities, but also of depressions, echoing intensities, drivenness that tipped into pain. I missed these things, or parts of them anyway, for they were as familiar to me as dense fog and drizzle, which has its own sort of lonely beauty, as does a desert or the most mournful of music. Having lived with chronic depression, a high-pitched panic, and a host of other psychiatric symptoms since my earliest years, I had made for myself an illness identity, a story of self that had illness as its main motive, the explanatory model on which my being was based. And now gone, I had stepped over the border into health. There was no more depression, which had felt like the stifling yet oddly comforting weight of a woolen blanket, or anxiety which lent a certain fluorescence to things, or voices which had always been there, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, some north star of sound in the night.
In the 12 years since she has left the hospital that had become a second home, Lauren has tamed her depression and learned to live with it. At times, it can be a precarious piece, but one that has allowed her to write and become a critically praised author.
When I was in the hospital, there was a mental health worker who was so smart, and she said to me around maybe my 4th time in, you know, you're just gonna come back here forever, aren't you? And it looked that way. It looked like that was gonna be my life. Well, in some ways I feel like I'm just so damn successful. But not for the reasons that you might think, but because I'm out, and I've stayed out.